Okay, so let's talk about feedback in the anterior pituitary, in these anterior pituitary pathways, right? So remember that when we went over feedback loops in the first set of lectures, when we were talking about homeostasis, we had these very simple feedback loops where they weren't that simple, but they were more simple than this, where we just had one integrating center, right? And our response was going to feed back and basically become the new stimulus, okay? In a situation like this, with the anterior pituitary, since we have multiple integrating centers, okay, our feedback loops get much more complicated, right? So we have a lot of different possible ways that we can provide feedback, okay? So what's diagrammed here is like sort of two different ways that we can provide feedback in an endocrine feedback loop, okay? The first is what we call short loop negative feedback. In short loop negative feedback, what happens is that the hormone from the anterior pituitary feeds back onto the hypothalamus, right? So again, remember the whole point of a negative feedback loop is to maintain homeostasis, right? So if you have a lot of this hormone, we'll just call it H2, following the diagram. If we have a lot of H2 around, we want to shut off production of H2 so that the levels don't get too high, right? So if we have H2, lots of H2, what it's going to do is it's going to provide feedback on the hypothalamus. It's going to tell the hypothalamus, hey, it's time to shut down production of H1. And then if we have less H1 around, we're going to then, as a result, get less H2. Okay, so this is how H2 is going to regulate its own levels within the body. All right. Okay, so in addition to short loop negative feedback, we also have what we call long loop negative feedback. And what happens in long loop negative feedback is we have our peripheral hormone, the last one in the pathway that's made by that last target organ, okay? That hormone is going to provide negative feedback back onto the anterior pituitary and on the hypothalamus. And again, I want to remind you that it is negative feedback, right? So what we're doing is if we make too much H3, we want to kind of rein that in. We want to bring down the levels of H3, right? So if we have a lot of H3, that H3 is going to tell the anterior pituitary, hey, stop making H2 or make less of it, okay? And it's going to tell the hypothalamus, okay, let's make less H1. Okay, if you have less H1 and less H2 around, then you're going to end up having less H3 being made because this endocrine gland right here is not receiving the signals, or it's receiving less of a signal from these guys to tell it to make H3. Okay, so short loop negative feedback, long loop negative feedback. All right, so let's take a look at an example. Okay, so this is an example of an endocrine pathway that involves the anterior pituitary. This is commonly known as the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and it's the set of events that lead to the secretion of cortisol, our kind of stress hormone, okay? So maybe I should kind of walk you through it. So in this pathway, the hypothalamus makes a hormone called CRH. CRH stimulates the anterior pituitary to make ACTH. ACTH then works on the adrenal cortex, that's what's shown here, and tells the adrenal cortex to make cortisol, okay? And then cortisol is gonna then go on and work on its target tissue to bring about a response, okay? So here is a task for you. Take a look at this and see if you can label the short and long loop negative feedback pathways in this example. So go ahead and hit pause and fill that out on your worksheet. Okay, so hopefully you figured that out. We'll go over it in class. Another thing that I want to mention, maybe I should back up, um, is that these feedback loops are, I don't know what to say. When we affect the levels of one hormone in one of these feedback loops, that's going to affect the levels of the other hormones as well, right? So in class, we're going to do a bunch of exercises where we think through, like, well, what if hormone H3 goes down? What, what effect does that have on the levels of H1 and H2? What happens, if we destroy the anterior pituitary? What are hormone levels going to look like then? So we'll go through a few scenarios so that we can kind of get a deeper appreciation for how these feedback loops work. Okay, all right, so to sum up hormone release from the anterior pituitary, we've got this figure here, okay? What we're looking at here is up on the top are all of the hormones that are synthesized by these hypothalamic cells, right? So remember, we have neurohormones being made by these hypothalamic cells and released into the bloodstream here, okay? So these are the guys that are coming out of these neurons here into the bloodstream, okay? Those guys are gonna travel through this portal system to the anterior pituitary, where they are going to work on these cells here, these endocrine cells, okay? These endocrine cells are going to make these 6 hormones, okay? And then those hormones are going to enter the general circulation to reach their targets, okay? In the case of prolactin, the target is just breast tissue and we get lactation happening. But for the rest of these guys are going to act on additional endocrine glands. So at their targets are endocrine glands, and we're going to get release of additional hormones. Okay. All right. So this is a question for you. Which of these hormones are trophic hormones? So go ahead and hit pause and answer that question. Okay, so hopefully you remember the definition of trophic and you figured it out. We'll go over it in class. Okay, so that wraps up our discussion of the pituitary gland. These are your learning goals right here. I'm not gonna read them, you can read them yourself. But I do want to point out this last learning goal we're gonna be working on a little more in class. So I'm trying to figure out what happens with the feedback loops when you remove one hormone or when you're like overproducing one of the hormones in that pathway. How does that affect the levels of the other hormones in the pathway? Okay, and then here are your vocabulary words. All right, I hope you enjoyed this video. See you next time.